All right. Good morning, everyone, or good evening. It's great to see you all. And we'll go ahead and get started. We're a couple of minutes after the hour. So let me start off with a couple of housekeeping things. And first, as antitrust policy notice, we do have people in this meeting from a number of different organizations who are competitors in the business sense. And because of that, we need to make sure that everything in this meeting follows with antitrust and competition laws. The second thing is that we do have a code of conduct for these meetings. And so we will be, we want to guarantee a harassment-free experience for everyone. And so we ask everyone to behave in accordance with professional standards. We have not had any problems with this before, and I doubt we will again, but it's just a reminder for us. And the last bit of housekeeping, we do want this session to be interactive. So please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to those at points during our session, and we'll also leave time at the end for question and answer. Again, I'm super excited to be here today with you all and to share what's some of the things that are going on in the Open Source Security Foundation. Our agenda for today, we have a section where we'll be talking about some of the recent supply chain attacks that are in the news. And for those, we'll be talking about things that you can do to help secure yourself against those, and also things that OpenSSF is doing and can be doing in the future. We'll also talk about an upcoming White House executive order on supply chain security, software supply chain security. So that'll be a fun, good chunk of our time. Again, it's interactive, so we'll be looking for and hoping for questions. Then we'll have an update on things that are happening in the OpenSSF, followed by two announcements from Michael Scavetta, who leads our Identifying Security Threats group. So they've been hard at work in that group, and they'll share with you some of the results from that. And then we've got one slide at the end where we just talk about what's next, kind of what we see on the horizon for OpenSSF, and we'll leave open for Q&A. Before we jump into our agenda and talking about in the news, I wanted to update you on some of the momentum in the open source OpenSSF. So we are 9 months now since we started the organization. We launched in August of 2020. We started with 19 member organizations. We were at our last quarter, we were at 36, and now we're at 47. Our individual participants has grown just from this quarter to last, 275 to nearly 360. Our website visits are up from 57 to 74. So, and that's just monthly visits. And then our edX course, which we announced early on, that was one of our first announcements in our first town hall meeting, has grown now, and we have over close to 3,200 participants in that. So it's exciting to see the interest in OpenSSF and the engagement, and see the pickup of some of the initiatives that we've sponsored. So with that, I will turn over and we'll let David Wheeler talk us through what's in the news. Go, David. You're on mute, David.
Trying to be so careful about muting myself when I'm not speaking. And so KU, I'll just tell you next when we go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about just 4 different kind of events that have been happening in the news, and some possible connections at least to OpenSSF. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today about things that have been happening in the news is the so-called dependency confusion attacks. First of all, it's a kind of attack, dependency confusion, and it exploits the ambiguity about the source of some dependency. So, most programs today bring in a large number of libraries from other places. It's a much more efficient way to work. But let's say that you depend on some library X and you say, hey, bring it in, but you actually have identified multiple sources for packages that you bring things in. Well, what happens if some package X that you are trying to bring in could come from multiple places? Well, somebody investigated this, namely Alex Bursan, and he found out that in fact an attack shows up. And here's how the attack works: the victim uses some private package registry, contains a number of packages, including something I'll call internal thing. And the victim says, hey, I'm going to add my list of dependencies, internal thing. And the victim is assuming that since internal thing only exists in their private repository, private registry, it'll obviously only come from there. But an attacker can either learn or guess that there's an internal repository with that name. Maybe they learn, maybe they guess. And so they create something with that name in a public registry. The public registry has no reason to deny it. It doesn't have anything of that name. Somebody wants that name. Awesome. And the attacker will often create it with a really big version number, 100.0.0. So obviously it's the very, very latest version of this. The next time the victim uses their build infrastructure, they're going to select and download internal thing from the public registry instead, and chaos ensues. So what can you do about this? Well, there are a couple quick, immediate solutions you can do. One is, of course, when you have identified a set of libraries you're bringing in, make sure you reference only one feed, only one repository. If there's only one, then there's no possibility of ambiguity. We're done. For a number of organizations, that doesn't really work. So another thing you can do is make sure you control your scopes. When you say, I want package internal thing, you make sure that for every package, you clearly identify where it's coming from. So yes, there's more than one source, but there's no ambiguity for any particular package. And finally, you can use client-side verification features to confirm, for example, that, oh, it has to match this hash, this known value, and that way it doesn't matter what the attacker does, it will be ignored. Now, how could the OpenSSF help? In the short term, we can educate people, but in the longer term, one thing that the OpenSSF could do is work with package managers to ensure that they're secure by default. Because I think in many, many cases, and certainly in this one, instead of trying to depend on humans to always, every turn, always do the right, not easy thing, it's far better to make the default, the easy thing, the obvious thing, the secure thing. So that in general, we want software, including package managers, to be secure by default. Next. Oh, by the way. Okay, codecov. So codecov is a very, very widely used service to measure test coverage. Obviously, it's important to test software if you care whether or not it works correctly. And there are various ways to measure to see, to at least get some sense of how good your test coverage is. So for example, if you write tests and you find out that only 5% of the lines of code in your library that you wrote are actually being tested, that's a pretty good indication that your tests are terrible. That means 95% of your code is no tests at all. And there are various kinds of ways to measure test coverage, but the important thing is that codecov provides a widely used service to make it easy to do. One of the mechanisms they provide for uploading data to them, which they need, is something called the codecov bash uploader. And it makes it very, very easy to provide updates, but the way they make it super easy is using a dangerous construct. And this is actually straight up the construct I've shown right here: bash, left then sign, curl-s, and a particular URL. This kind of code is a construct called a pipe to shell. You're grabbing some data from the internet and sending it directly to a shell for execution. This is widely considered dangerous and an insecure practice. There's no opportunity to check anything. You just are downloading it, and as you download it, you immediately execute it. In fact, there are known attacks where this is detectable, where it detects that you're doing this, and the attacker could give you malicious code instead of the normal code. So this is not generally considered a good practice. In January 2021, an attacker subverted the distributed version of Bash Uploader. Now, what was in the codecov file that was being downloaded was not the same as the GitHub code, but it didn't matter because no one was seeing it. They were piping the code directly to the shell, so there's no opportunity to notice that what was being downloaded was not the correct version. It was in fact a subverted version. It exfiltrated environment variables such as API keys, deployment keys, and so on. And so basically, the attacker managed to get all sorts of sensitive and secret data. That's not good. So what can you do? Well, obviously, one thing you can do is apply best practices. So in general, trying to avoid pipe to shell is a good thing. And in fact, the OpenSSF Secure Software Development Fundamentals course, which we mentioned earlier, okay, specifically in the section on downloading and installing reusable software, specifically discusses why pipe to shell is dangerous and why in most cases it should be avoided. Yes, the amount of risk varies, and maybe it's not high enough risk to worry about in some cases, but it's certainly something you should think about before you do. In the longer term, the OpenSSF is already working to try to help people to avoid these kinds of problems. In the longer term, OpenSSF could even help some projects replace pipe to shell where they are recommending it with more secure approaches as their default. And so that again, so that people are less likely to use more dangerous practices and more likely to use practices that are easier to defend. By the way, Kay mentioned this earlier, but I'd love to remind. Questions, comments, suggestions are absolutely welcome as we go along. Happy to try to answer some things. Next. All right. Third up, I want to talk about an issue that involves University of Minnesota and in particular a paper called the Hypocrite Commits paper. This is a somewhat unusual news thing because this actually directly involves the Linux Foundation. But you know, we're having this meeting, and I thought it'd be important to at least briefly discuss this, and I think other people agree with me also. So the University of Minnesota wanted to do some experiments. Fine, great, research, good. And what they want to do is they wanted to try to measure the Linux kernel processes resistance to intentionally vulnerable proposals. Now, nothing wrong with that goal. But in practice, what they did is they experimented and by sending commits to, sending proposals to humans. And basically what this meant was they're performing experiments on humans without their prior consent. This is a huge no-no. Anybody who is curious, you can do some searches and find out why since the 1950s it's been incredibly important in the research community to check on and get consent, even for simple things like surveys. Typically, you have to go through things like institutional review board and other processes. Unfortunately, the experimenters didn't do any of that. They just experimented on people. They didn't even go through an institutional review board until after their experiment was done, which is not okay. And their IRB then approved the experience on people without their consent, which is also kind of concerning to us. All right. So the Linux kernel has basically soft banned the entire University of Minnesota. They're in process of reviewing all commits from the University of Minnesota because, frankly, as soon as this became clear, the Linux kernel is too important to have any questions about whether or not there's malicious code in there. And when this was revealed, it was not clear exactly what was done that was potentially intentionally vulnerable. So the Linux Foundation did send a letter to the University of Minnesota. You can actually, ZDNet's actually published it now. So if you're curious, you can see what the requirements were. We weren't looking for anybody's heads. We just wanted to heal the problems. Make sure that what was known, that we want to make sure we knew exactly what had been submitted that was potentially vulnerable and known to be vulnerable, and other things like how can we make sure that this kind of event doesn't happen again. The paper was formally withdrawn. Um, we actually are okay with things being on the internet, but we just don't think that things that do unethical research should get formal credit. Um, but we didn't want to, at this point it's done, it's done. That's all, that's the one other thing that we asked for. The University of Maryland, Minnesota actually has recently posted a list of proposals that were intentionally vulnerable. People are kind of going through and just making sure, because again, we want to make absolutely certain to the best that anybody can that no vulnerabilities were inserted into the Linux kernel or any other, because at the time we weren't even sure if just the Linux kernel had been targeted. I will note that there is humor here. One of their proposals that was supposed to have a hidden vulnerability, in fact, had a bug, and because it had a bug, it was actually correct, and so that one was accepted, and it appears that all because it actually did fix something, and everything else appears to have been rejected. That were intentionally vulnerable. There's still some double checks and triple checks, but so what can you do? Well, first of all, research is great. The Linux Foundation itself funds research. Research is great stuff. We love research. Please be ethical in general. Experiments on humans need consent. If you have questions, you can go back and look at the history of this and why, since really the 1950s, this has been. I don't know the exact dates on some of this stuff, but it's very, very important that experiments on humans need consent and be ethical. All right, use tools to look for likely vulnerabilities. The OpenSSF's tooling working group is, of course, working to make this easier to do. Consider tools to look for suspicious patterns. Um, Having code conventions that reduce the likelihood of certain kinds of attacks is a good thing. And of course, in general, having eyeballs on code bases, reviews, extremely important. Um, Okay, let's see here. Chaos, and I think actually that will be best asked answered later. So I see a question in the chat. Let's talk about that a little bit later, where I think it'll be in better context. Next. Okay, White House executive orders. I've there are actually again, this involves the U.S. federal government. Um, there are actually two executive orders that are probably especially related to this group. One is already out. It came out in February. It's called Executive Order on America's Supply Chains. In general, it wants reviews at various date and times of various supply chains to try to identify supply chain vulnerabilities, and in general to increase resiliency of the country. Um, it's not limited to software at all. It's just in general supply chains of certain especially important areas, which you probably could guess without even reading the letter, but the executive order is public. Next is it's known that there is a cyber executive order to come. It's not public, so its contents, to me at least, are unclear. However, several folks are apparently involved, and there have been some leaks about what it appears, what at least drafts have contained. So while we don't know what it's going to contain, we do have some indication of what it's likely to contain. And so, in a spirit of trying to get prepared, let me just quickly summarize. First of all, it's quite clear that this order was spurred in part by a really devastating subversion by SolarWinds Orion. um, the U.S. government is extremely spun up from this. I saw one report that estimates the damage caused by the SolarWinds Orion was about $100 billion. That doesn't mean that suddenly $100 billion was lifted from some account. It means that the cost to repair the various damage and to undo and redo things and basically eliminate and replace whole programs may end up at that number. I don't know how much to believe that number, but it's quite clear that it was substantial. Unsurprisingly, when something is substantial, to an organization, the organization wants to do something about it. I think it's so the likely contents are that, first of all, companies that do business with the federal government will have to meet some security standards and swiftly report incidents. They're probably going to strengthen DHS and in particular its Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, the CISA. Give it more power, more authorities, more money. Federal agencies are being asked to move to multi-factor authentication and to improve FedRAMP, which is the U.S. government's way to examine cloud services. They want to move more to what's called zero trust. I realize that's a weird name. But the idea here is just because you're on a network, it doesn't matter. We can't trust everything that's going on a network. And by the way, OpenSSF courses can help them do that because, okay. CISA and NIST are trying to identify critical software for more action. That's very connected to what the OpenSSF's critical projects working group is doing. And I'm hoping that, okay. Let's see here. Requires software bill of materials in some cases. So just having a software bill of materials doesn't automatically fix problems, but it means that there's visibility to know about things like, for example, oh, you use that component, what version do you use? That has a known vulnerability. Is it vulnerable in this context or not? It's hard to answer that question without knowing what's in the software, a larger software or software component or a larger system with software in it. There may be some sort of software security grades. We don't know very much about this, but I will note that the OpenSSF's Best Practices Working Group and Security Threats Working Group has been working on those sorts of things. Okay, and that is it. I think I am at time. So any last questions? Otherwise, I'm done. What package managers can do to help prevent attacks like dependency confusion? I think the quick answer here, as I mentioned earlier, actually, Kay, can you jump back up real fast, is basically security by default. There's different ways a package manager can implement how, when it sees a request for a package, how to make sure that the dependency confusion can't happen. But basically, you can make sure that when you load in a package, it comes from one and only one source. There are many specific ways you can accomplish that, and which one depends on various factors. But the final goal really is when you say, I want internal package, you shouldn't have to say, I want internal package and hope that the package manager guesses the right source. You want to make sure the package manager knows how to get the correct source and ignores the wrong one. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So let's move on then, and we'll have Ryan talk with us about some of the great work that's happening in our working groups in OpenSSF. Ryan?
Thank you, Kate. Next slide, please. So real quick, to kind of kick off, give you a little bit of background for those that aren't already familiar. The OpenSSF has a group called the Technical Advisory Council, and one of the things that we're responsible for is oversight for all the various technical initiatives, working groups that OpenSSF is working on. And what we do is we try to facilitate the collaboration between those groups, make sure that we don't have overlap and that each one's working together sort of towards this common goal. Another thing that we help with is identifying funding, resourcing requirements, and helping prioritize that with the governing board. The governing board is actually the one that helps create budgets and dole out all the money, but we help identify the needs across the various working groups. Next, please. So some of the things that the TAC, the Advisory Council, has been working on in the past few months, we actually went through and we reviewed all of the different working groups that we have and their charters, and we approved them. So, we went through kind of a formal review process. We've worked on our code of conduct. And then what we've got coming up is we've sort of been building a lot of this work towards a roadmap. So in the last town hall, we talked about a mission statement and a vision, and now we're working towards this roadmap of technical initiatives. And this roadmap is kind of like a giant backlog of all the things that we could be working on. As we all know, there's a ton of work that we could do for security, particularly for open source. And so we have a large collection, a big document that we're working through to create that roadmap. We're also starting to focus on improving and incorporating, I should say, the diversity, civility, and inclusion. And so we're going to start taking that on and formalizing that process. And then we've also been working on the budget. So the governing board, like I mentioned, is driving budget, and then we're coordinating with them in the working groups to get all that figured out. Next, please. All right, so what have the working groups actually been doing? So we have 6 different working groups currently. The best practices group, they include things like the CII best practices badge that existed before OpenSSF, and we brought that in. And what they've been doing is they have some new tooling that they released to work on some automation. They began work on a Swahili translation, which I'm personally excited about. And then we added a new quote, project is maintained criteria. So that's one of the factors for the best practices badge. And then we have the edX course for secure software development fundamentals. We've got the content available in Markdown format now that's a little bit easier to consume for some folks. We enable others to build on top of the educational materials. And then we're also working with the CRE team to integrate some of those requirements. And then another group is the security tooling working group, and they've created a draft of a guide to security tools. So they're kind of iterating through all the different tools that exist out there and putting them into a document that makes it easier for people to find tooling that's available to them. Next, please. We also have the vulnerability disclosure working group, and they're working on a couple different documents. So they're identifying all these different pain points around vulnerability disclosure, and they'll leverage that to incorporate towards different requirements and ways to improve that. They've got a white paper that they're working on that for OSS projects around vulnerability disclosure as well. And then they're creating guidance for what the vulnerability management process should be for OSS projects. As we know, that's a huge challenge, and how to disclose and disclose responsibly and identify these things. So they're working on that. And then the next group is the identifying security threats working group. And so they've got some really cool things coming up, and I'm not going to spoil it from Mike Scavetta. He's got the big demo, but some of the things are security reviews project, and you'll find out more in a moment, and also the metrics dashboard, of which Mike is going to give a really, really cool demo for that. Next slide, please. And then additionally, one of the things that the TAC has kind of been working on that affects all of OpenSSF is we've been working with OSTIF, who has a proposal for managing audits for open source projects. So they've created from a vast number of resources and different materials, a list of critical open source projects that would be useful to have security audits performed on. So they have a process and a lot of experience doing this type of work. So we're coordinating with them to get a lot of that work done. And then the results of that initiative will actually be published within the OpenSSF security reviews repo, which Michael is going to talk about here in a minute. So we've discussed it at the TAC and everybody's excited about it. So we'll be working on that in the coming months as well. All right. And with that, I will hand it over to Mike Scavetta.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Next slide. So hi, everybody. I'm Mike Scavetta. I lead the Identifying Security Threats Working Group. I have 2 nice announcements here. First is the open source security metrics project that we've been working on. So this is available today at metrics.openssf.org. The purpose of this is to collect, curate, aggregate security metrics about open source projects. The goal here is to enable you to make a better informed decision about the security posture of individual open source projects. Next slide. So what does this really mean? So this is a relatively new project. I think we officially, it became live about a week and a half ago or so. So at this point, we are collecting existing metrics, which means, fortunately, we have some nice data sources. Right now, they're all from the OpenSSF. So the scorecard project, which collects information on, it analyzes open source projects, looking for things that can be, where the posture can be pulled out automatically. The criticality score, which is a measure of the importance or influence of a project. The best practices badge program, which is how well does a project conform to commonly understood best practices, and the security reviews project, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we smush all this stuff together, we bring it into a single database, and we put a dashboard on the top of it. So if you, next slide. So what's the purpose of this? Right? And we really see kind of three main consumers of this. And first is an author themselves. So, I run an open source project, and I would like to know, like, how good am I doing relative to my peers? Are there simple things that I can do to improve my security posture? For consumers, if I have a choice of, 12 different, JSON parsers or 12 different libraries that do similar things in whatever technology stack I'm using, is there a way for me to objectively choose one or the other based on if security were one of my top order bits there? And then in aggregate, for organizations that have security or risk or maybe even compliance teams, to say we're using a whole lot of open source, because they're probably using a whole lot of open source. Which of those projects are the riskiest? Which of those need investment? Perhaps for OpenSSF, and the part of the critical projects working group is focusing investment and attention on the most critical projects out there. It's a little self-referential because we're using their data to populate the dashboard, but having a view per component, and then ultimately some sort of aggregate view, we think will help everybody make better decisions and have things be less subjective. But we're also looking for other ideas. So if you have a need for, if you think that this kind of data would be useful to you, please let us know. We think this is the kind of thing that, as we build it and as it gets more populated and better, more uses will become apparent. Next slide. So current state is we have about 105,000 open source projects that have at least some data for one of the data sources. Most of that data comes from the criticality project. They have about over 100,000 that they've collected themselves. We've launched this on an initial website, which is, as I said, metrics.openssf.org. It has really basic features like searching and things like that. We use Grafana as the dashboard front end, so that helps us be very agile, and we can change things and improve them very quickly. And we have a very simple JSON API, which, if you hit the next slide, sorry, maybe it's in a couple slides. We have a really simple JSON API that's helpful. So next slide. But this is really important. This is super alpha quality. It can change, it can go down. Please don't integrate this into anything really important where you'll be woken up in the middle of the night if our service goes down. It will absolutely improve over time. We wanted to get something out quickly, gather feedback, iterate, and build on it, rather than waiting any longer for the perfect system to be designed, because we will be waiting forever. Next slide. So if you start out here and you type a search term in that search box, so let's say we're going to type Kubernetes, and you hit the next slide, you'll see a list of projects that we have data for that have Kubernetes in the name. There are two links. The link on the left takes you to the dashboard. The link on the right takes you to the API view. This is super kludgy, not great UX, but that's what it is right now. So you can copy the URL that you saw on the right and figure out how to call the JSON API yourself. But if you click on the link on the left, next slide, this is the Grafana front end. So what you have is, on the top left, or kind of that top section is, project details that we've been able to pull out of the various data sources, URLs that we found in descriptions and other kind of metadata, security reviews if we have any, will be there. And then the 3 rows below come from, well, one comes from, as the text suggests, one comes from the criticality score, one from the best practices badge program, and one from the scorecard. And these are color coded to make sense. So, in most of these, a check mark is this is a good thing. So for the Kubernetes project, if you see the blue square that says 2017 and you look to the right of that, that says static analysis used, that is saying the best practices badge program asserts that the Kubernetes project uses static analysis. That's great. But it also says that one more to the right, that the Kubernetes does not use dynamic analysis. Now, as I'm speaking now, I'm curious as to how it could be not used, but the one below is fixed. So perhaps there's some data issues. The point, though, is that you should be able to trust that a check mark means it meets the thing, and an X means it doesn't meet the thing. Where we don't have data, or the data is incomplete, you get some sort of a question mark or something that says like no info. So we want to improve this over time. We don't know if these are the right, all exactly the right metrics. We've chosen a subset of the things that are collected. There's certainly more that we want to do. We want to collect things directly from GitHub. Actually, if you go to the next slide, we have some kind of next steps on this. So yeah, so we want obviously to improve the UX. We want the additional metrics to tell the right story. There was a comment on, hey, what about the chaos working group, the chaos risk working group? I've already kind of started to reach out there. I'm planning on attending the next meeting. David, I think you were a regular attendee there. So right now, consider this kind of an experiment that went live. So where the future holds and this project versus chaos, I don't think anybody benefits by having multiple groups doing exactly the same work, but I think there's also room for experimentation all around. So we are aware of the chaos working group, and we're going to have a better story hopefully in 3 months. The final point there is, perhaps, and this is contentious, where does the line between objective data? So, everything you saw in the previous slides are pretty objective. Like it's, you could argue with the algorithm that comes up with the score, but the score is the score. What none of those are doing is saying this thing is good. This thing gets an A+, because we say so. But I think there's a good argument for why consumers, especially risk teams and compliance teams and true consumers, they would really benefit, I think, by having the SSL lab style. You got an A+. These are all A+ projects, and these are B+ projects, and they can get to an A- by doing X, Y, and Z. We don't have specific plans on implementing this today, but it's the type of conversations that we want to have in the near term about how to make this more useful and more valuable, because I think sometimes you can have a dashboard that has a huge amount of data that ordinary humans just don't know how to process. Like, is this a good thing? Am I supposed to be happy when I'm looking at this, or sad? So we want to make this consumer centric. Our next working group is on May 10th. Please join. There are instructions at the link below, or if you're interested in this project in particular, the link to the project is there. There are instructions on how to set up a local development environment and suck in all the data and play yourself. And really looking forward to where this is going in the future. And I just want to, huge thanks to the folks on that put together the scorecard and the criticality, and David on the badge program. This project would be nothing without those data sources already being collected and provided. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that was the metric dashboard project. Second project is the security reviews project. Next slide. So the purpose of this project is to establish a community collection of security reviews performed against open source software components. So today, if you wanted to understand the security posture of an open source component, you want to use foo, and you want to say, hey, is foo safe to use? It's like really important. Am I putting it in a pacemaker, or I'm putting it in a helicopter I'm going to send to Mars? Should I worry about this? And you can do all the work yourself, and you can run tools. You can look for public CVEs and things like that. But let's suppose you do that, and you spend X number of days doing this work, and then you decide, you know what, this thing's actually pretty good. Well, today, lots of organizations do things like that, but they keep this information to themselves. They'll throw it in an Excel spreadsheet or a database or something, and maybe other users within their organization, or maybe just their team, would be aware of it. And that's great for them, except that now someone else wants to take the same component and put it in a self-driving car and does the same work. So at best, we're super inefficient here. And wouldn't it be better if those results were shared among these organizations, so that the second organization, if they don't trust it, they could do it again, or maybe they can make whatever decision they want, but at least it'll be more information that they'll have, saying that Bob reviewed a component and thought it was okay, or thought it's okay, but not in this way, or make sure this component is not meant for direct internet connectivity, so make sure you put it's a back-end component or something. So I think that these things it's something that would be useful to readers. Also today, a lot of these things exist in the form of third-party audit reports. So you'll have NCC Group or Trail of Bits or OSTIF. They'll do a security review, and they'll have the results available on their website. And these things are pretty distributed, because if you don't know that Trail of Bits did an assessment of zlib, you won't really know to go there. You'd have to splunk around the maybe the zlib repository, and there might be a reference there or something. But at least collecting references to all these things in one place also makes it easier to find. So I say, has anybody looked at zlib? Oh, it's been Trail of Bits and these three other organizations, and this is what they have to say. So we think that's useful. And the second part of this is similar, which is right now, most security data that you get is either absent or negative. So if you wanted to say, has anybody ever looked at foo? And you go out and you don't see anything, does that mean that lots of people have looked at foo and it looked fine and they simply didn't have anything to report? Or did or have people looked at it and they didn't share it, or has no one ever looked at it? So it's kind of like, all news is bad news in some ways for security data. While the very, the reflection of we looked at this component and it looks fine, is something that, other than audit reports that occasionally come back with gold stars, there isn't much of that. So next slide. So we put together this community collection of security reviews, but I want to make it really, really crystal clear here. This is not a place to disclose new vulnerabilities. If you found something, we're not a zero-day collection agency. We are not going to notify projects when you report them to us. That's not this project's place in the universe. Please report things responsibly, and we have a workflow on the project page. What we're looking for is either positive indicators or things that may not be obvious to the consumer of the open source project, but are nevertheless important. Next slide. So this is an example of one that OSTF contributed for OpenSSL 1.1.1. And it's a summary, and it references, I believe at the bottom of this review, it references the original review content. But the idea would be that this would be searchable, it would be in one place, it would be easy to consume, and with, actually, if you go to the next slide, with the, we have a simple, quick start where you can, put in a review and you choose, like, what have you done? Well, I did static analysis, or I did a code review, or I just looked at the website. You disclose things like, how severe are the issues that you found? Is this something that, technically, yes, it's a vulnerability, but, it's not anything that folks should worry about? Or is it something that, like, nobody should be using this component at all because of, this horrible thing? And then, so really what I'm saying is, we're looking for contributions here. We want organizations that do this for a living to be willing to contribute at least references and a summary, and point back to their original content for the projects for the assessments that they've done. Individual security researchers, if you're part of an organization where this is what you do, consider submitting it, and helping the next team out, and hopefully someone else will help you out, and we're all kind of better off this way. I don't think any of our organizations succeed by by open source being less secure, or their insecurity being less understood. So you can just fill out this form, submit a pull request, and if you have questions, obviously ask. This is also a very new project that we will be learning as we go. Next slide. Yeah, so we have a small but growing set of reviews. Yeah, as I said, please consider contributing. Our project website is there, OSSF/security reviews. I think that's my last slide. Over to you.
Okay, great. So one last slide, and then we'll open up for questions about anything. We did get some questions as we were going along, but we'll leave a little bit of time for others. There, in addition to all the work that's going on in OpenSSF, we do have a few things that are upcoming that I thought I would mention to you. One is David mentioned during some of the slides on OpenSSF, and Ryan mentioned in his session, we are working on some budgeting from OpenSSF to security-related projects. And specifically, we're working on a grant program where we allow members of the community to provide funds to this grant program, and then we do some vetting of projects and then decide which projects we will allocate funds to, and then those projects will get in, we make them part of the official OpenSSF funded projects. So that's pretty exciting. The budget committee in OpenSSF is working on that program now, and we'll be able to announce that by our next quarterly meeting. There are two other projects I wanted to bring to your attention as things to watch that are happening. These are related to supply chain security. One is a project originally initiated by Google, but it's open for anyone to participate. And there's some discussions about this going on in the Developer Identity Attestation Working Group. This is called Security Levels for Supply Chain Artifacts, SLSA. And this also fits nicely with the work that we're looking at for security metrics, where we try to define these, levels of security that projects can be measured objectively for. So anyway, have a look at that. It's just a project to watch. There's another project that's doing some exciting work around supply chain, end-to-end supply chain integrity, and that's in Toto. And so you can learn more about that there. There are a couple of new ITEs, which is in toto enhancement, that are being driven by Google, but are getting some community support, strong community support. So just, if you're looking at what's happening in supply chain security, those might be a couple of things to look at. So those are some upcoming things, and now we'll leave open in case people have questions. You might have seen just pop up on your screen. We'd love to have you provide some feedback to us about how the session went today, and we'll take that seriously. We'll also have a note. We'll send out an email that will get you to a link where you can provide some comment form feedback. This is just a quick one or another. How would you rate the session? So please fill that out. Any questions from anyone? We'll leave a couple of minutes. Oh, let's see. We might have some trouble with the poll. I think it got started and then might have ended prematurely. Any other questions or thoughts about anything you saw in the news or things that the group is working on? Thank you, Carlo.
I think we're going to just relaunch the poll.
Okay.
Carly, unless you have another idea there.
We'll just unfortunately lose all of the.
That's okay. I think everybody's still on.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Let's
see.
Are you going to relaunch it?
Let's see.
I have a button for that, Carly. You want me to do it?
It's since it's closed, it's no longer an option to relaunch, but
I can't relaunch it.
You are able to? Okay.
Yes, I am. So I will just relaunch.
Awesome.
We're just going to continue.
Thank you,
Okay,
David.
so sorry about that, folks. We accidentally closed early, and that's actually my fault. So
oh, David.
I'll admit blame.
All right, yeah, take a minute to do that, everyone. And then while you're doing that, I'll just mention that we'd love to have people get involved. So you can join a technical working list, you can join a mailing list. We have a calendar that shows our public meetings, and all of those meetings where anyone's welcome. There's a Slack channel, an easy way, low investment way to just ask a question for any of the working groups. We record all of our meetings, and you can find meeting recordings on a YouTube channel. And then for organizations, you can become a corporate member. Right now, it's pretty easy to become a corporate member. Just be a member of the Linux Foundation, and OpenSSF is an opt-in to join at no cost. Next year, we are evaluating some member fees, and those will help support the work that we do to fund open source projects. And we'll announce more about that shortly. Okay, so with that, I think that we are done for today. Thanks everyone for joining. We really appreciate your support, your involvement, and your support. And we'll see you at our next town hall in 3 months from now. Bye, everyone.